That's certainly my perception, and you point out the Susan Rice meeting and that run up to the March visit with President Obama with King Abdullah. They seem to be putting in place an operational framework and much greater alignment, at least vis-a-vis Syria. Now, I'm going to let you off the hook with rightly or wrongly, because I'd say, I'd ask you to actually lay down a bet as to whether that perception is accurate in terms of U.S. withdrawal. But more importantly, with regard to going forward, who leads in the Obama White House on the Hill? Who leads intellectually on this issue? Obviously, John McCain is a vocal presence, but who do you think are going to be playing an important role in the choices we make?
I think that Senator McCain and Senator Lindsey Graham, Senator Menendez, who's on the Democratic side, of course chairing the Foreign Relations Committee, have been advocates of a more interventionist response, both not necessarily putting boots on the ground, they stop there, but more active bombing, more aggressive outfitting. It was just announced within the period that we've been discussing that the White House is asking for $500 million to quickly supply and support Syrian rebel forces that have been vetted. So we're going to get back to the old equation we've been talking about of vetting moderates. The White House is feeling real pressure to do the things it hasn't wanted to do. Senator McCain and Senator Graham have been very critical of the White House, and they were embracing Prince Bandar, saying Bandar is doing what we're not doing. Bandar is building an army. Bandar is funding and outfitting groups in ways that the United States is not. And I think we have to be very worried, very careful and cautious about that the instinct that the White House has had to show restraint has probably been a correct one. That Martin Dempsey, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Chuck Hagel, Joe Biden, and others who know these players, have been around this for a long time, have been concerned that you can repeat history here, that you can go out, think that you're playing with a team that you're playing with and trying to empower, and they may look like they're just in civil society and carry some of the DNA of what we all care about. But at the end of the day, what was happening when we were giving arms and troops to the FSA, many of those arms and material were falling into the hands of al-Nusra and ISIS. Not just because al-Nusra and ISIS were taking over the depots, which they were in some cases, but FSA fighters were selling what they had acquired. I mean, it's not, people think there are neat lines. You had FSA brigades and soldiers that basically said, this is a crazy situation we're in, and some of them would just sell their arms to the others. So a lot would leach out of the process. So I think that those people, it's a legitimate and important discussion to have about how do you empower in a Syrian civil war the folks that we like and we want to win. Well, you can try and do tilting point things. The problem is, I kept telling everybody, Syria is a civil war on top of which is a global competition of other key players. It's such a mistake to just look inside the Syria silo of the players inside Assad versus others, because Russia's involved, Iran is involved, of course the United States, France, Turkey, and everyone is meddling in the interior. And so that creates quicksand. It's just a very difficult situation. And after spending trillions of dollars, achieving very, very little that I think has been sustainable in Iraq, and with Tariq al-Hashimi, with Maliki. Maliki has just been such a nightmare leader. I mean, for 2.5 years, he has not had a balanced government that represents the interest of its broad people, and no one has been blowing that whistle. From the moment he ran Tariq al-Hashimi out of the country, he's essentially kept the Sunnis bootstrapped and out. And what did people think was going to happen over time? That this was somehow going to not blow up? And I think that the important, as I've been saying, in other commentary, this is not really an ISIS story. It's an angry Sunni story, because the other Sunni brigades, Sunni leaders, even responsible leaders who feel completely left behind and neglected by Maliki are acquiescing to what's happening. There have been some great Washington Post profiles of some of these Sunni Islamic commanders and their plans, which they're fairly explicit about, to say we're going to turn our guns on ISIS as soon as we get rid of Maliki, in the sense that they're our temporary ally now, but they'll be our rival in the future. That's very messy. And so for America to intervene, or the West to intervene in that, means an adoption of an awful lot of terrible things. The notion that you can knock back this impulse and come up with kind of a Betty Crocker cake mix to all of a sudden come up with a government in a week that Sunni tribal leaders are going to trust after everything Maliki has done, I think is naive. I think I admire John Kerry for putting it on the table and showing what should have been done a year ago. But the fact of the matter is, it probably isn't going to go that direction. So everything that we're talking about today, in my view, is likely to get significantly worse, significantly more bloody and horrible for the people there. A lot more frustration and anger by, you know, the John McCains and Lindsey Grahams and people who lament that American power isn't being deployed in the way that they would deploy it. And you're going to see Barack Obama weighing these various things, like making the commitment on whatnot, but knowing that fundamentally he's not going to be able to solve that Sunni-Shia conflict quickly. The one thing we're not doing, and I'm very, you know, constructively critical, or try to be, with the White House, is we have been talking to Iran about nuclear weapons. We've been talking to a lot of, and that is a controversial issue around, you know, much of the country, but it's a big potential step forward. We see Bashar al-Assad is much more resilient than we thought he would be, and then he's got a Russia patron, and we've had a problem with Russia in a lot of other areas. We need to have a strategic conversation with the people that we're not dealing with and get beyond the posturing and the kind of foreplay that requires everybody to, you know, accept one set of terms or another. You need to get a deal between the Saudis and the Iranians and the Russians and the Turks and the Americans about what a responsible play in the Middle East region will look like. If we don't kick this to a higher level, it's going to continue to churn, and it's going to be staggeringly horrible.
You know, you're talking about threading the needle, and the fact is, as you just laid out, you're threading hundreds of needles.
Yeah.
It's an extraordinarily difficult and multivariate and simultaneous, coincidental, sequencing, any number of things that need to happen. We was curious about, and I don't want to, I know you have a limited time, but the conversation we just had, which is very interesting, with Jamal Khashoggi, and who's editor-in-chief of Al Arab News Channel, Fahad Nasser with JTG, and Hardin Lang with the Center for American Progress. So they've just done a study called On the Brink with Recommendations. One of the conversations that came up, well, two things came up. One is that Syria is the keystone, in particular Assad. So much of this comes back to Assad and how he's played this. But the thought, too, came up was, you know, can you let this play out? And the conclusion was absolutely not. We have to find a way to plug in somewhere, because if it's left to its own devices, it just takes down the whole region. And
well,
as you
I mean,
say,
the question is, anything like that requires a consideration of costs and benefits. I mean, you can be sentimental about it. You can say, oh, the U.S. needs to be engaged. There are lots of different levels of engagement. I want people to be clear by what they mean. If they mean serious adoption of these issues, of deploying of, you know, security and defense capacity that you know, gets up at the levels of what we saw with the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, that will greatly cripple America's ability to be a long-term viable power in a lot of other areas. So I think it's one thing to say, you know, out of, you know, some soporific notion that America needs to be engaged in some way, but it's got to be have a clear discussion of costs and benefits. These problems we may be seeing in the region may be those big insoluble ones that are just going to take a long time to sort out, and we can matter at the edges. I believe in engagement at the edges, but I don't want to deeply engage, because I believe that, you know, that one thing that isn't often thought about by America's, you know, proclivity to try to put bases in many places in the world is that they're not just anchors of stability, they can actually trigger instability. We saw that as one element in the bases that had been in the Saudi region before. I believe that it would have been the case had we left bases in Iraq. It will be interesting to see what degree that U.S. troops that are left behind in Afghanistan are stabilizers or are instigators of further instability, because what we saw in Afghanistan, for instance, as U.S. troop presence grew, the size of the opposition grew in direct relation, you know, that people that were not fighting against us decided to join the Taliban, decided to fight us. So you've got to be critical in some ways and think to a certain degree objectively about what the strategic possibilities are. And I don't believe that Syria is necessarily the linchpin. It may be other issues. Kurdistan. The Kurds are so frustrated with what has happened in Iraq. They've often wanted to go on their own independent. That may be another element here that we're discussing in the next few months, is what happens with the 3 million Kurds in Syria, the many, many Kurds in Turkey, and the kind of new demand that Kurdistan wants to become its own state. That would have a huge impact in terms of creating other impulses of ethnic groups that essentially want to nationalize and carve out territory.
Absolutely, and the Turks just, for the first time ever, indicated an openness to that possibility. So yes, so you're adding another needle to thread. Thank you, Steve.
Well, I didn't hear Jamal Khashoggi, who's someone I greatly respect and would be really interested to sort of see where he's at. Because I think the Saudis have been frustrated with America's positions on Egypt, on Syria, on Iraq, and yet they know that the relationship is still very fundamental. It reminds me of things that Prince Turki Al Faisal said, is that the way to confront Iran is building capacity, building networks, strengthening things. He saw an Arab-Israeli peace deal as part of that you could create common interests among Sunni states in the region that would become essentially federated in interest, at least with Israel, which is a regional superpower in and of itself. That doesn't necessarily lead to war. That becomes, in an odd way, to go back to the old days of U.S.-Soviet competition, it becomes a stabilizer. It's when both sides sort of see incredible weakness and incredible volatility that you've got a lot of move. But if you were to basically create larger networks, and even if the Iranians were to maintain, their Syrian network and others, that could actually become something that generated stability over the long run. I think that door closed some time ago, but it would be interesting to hear, from someone like Jamal Khashoggi, what he sees as the Soviet strategic option right now.
And I can't speak for Jamal, but I think you hit it on the head with regard to the level of Saudi confidence in the U.S. choices. I think there's certainly tremendous institutional, as you say, tremendous institutional coordination on key areas of counterterrorism and obviously energy and other areas. There's a very dubious assessment of U.S. judgment in the past. Right. And certainly a great concern of its political will, and two things that Saudis are watching very closely right at this moment. What are we going to decide to do, and what will we have the will to do, because it affects them and it should involve them, I think, which is why they're very, very keen to be part of this conversation. But Steve, thank you so much. I know pleasure, you took some time out of your day to have this conversation. Hope the rest of your time there in Aspen goes well, and we greatly appreciate it.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Richard.